Rupert Lowe, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I was going to ask this question in the next session, but I thought it was rather more appropriate to ask it of you. Now, obviously, we are all concerned about the employment of people and their families and their communities and everything else. But the thing I'm maybe missing, and I was going to ask you what you think about this, is I can't see how this intervention in steelmaking in the UK can work until we actually get a proper plan, a business plan, which sets out how we're going to do it. And I may be missing something, perhaps you can enlighten me, but while we have a lunatic policy on energy, because the basis of steelmaking, as I don't need to tell you, is cheap energy. And we're talking about China, Jinji, or whatever they call themselves.
Jingye.
But at the end of the day, China is still mining coal, building railways, and it is burning coal, as in India, in their power stations. So we have this fixation with decarbonisation, which, by the way, carbon is at a relatively low level historically in geological time, but yet we have a fixation about it. So what I wanted to know is, surely by intervening without a plan, aren't we just consigning the British taxpayer to funding the losses that we make because of our lunatic energy policy, which means that steel making is destined to fail in this country until we get the sort of dynamics right? Am I missing something?
So the first point is the cost of not intervening is unfathomable.
No, that's not the question I asked.
Please let me finish.
I accept that. But I'm asking you the question about
Let Charlotte do the counterfactual first.
Thank you. Yeah. The cost of not intervening is unfathomable. So if the government hadn't acted at that time in that way, then those jobs would be gone. And we wouldn't have any debate about energy policy or decarbonisation or the emission trading scheme, because it wouldn't matter, because the blast furnaces would have died and those jobs would have disappeared.
No, I get that.
And I think that there's... so there is obviously work to do on energy policy, and energy is action on energy policy, on procurement, on trading rules have been something that the unions have long campaigned for intervention on to level the playing field. But there is a misconception that decarbonisation is driving these policy decisions, and it's not. So if you look at the coke oven closure at Scunthorpe, which happened a couple of years previous, that wasn't because the carbon emissions were costing so much they had to close them. It was because Jingye had not invested, and the predecessors, Grable and Tata Steel before that, had not invested in this infrastructure in decades. And so it was a death trap. And they had to close it because it wouldn't work anymore. And then we rewrite history to say it was closed because of the carbon emissions, and the cost of those made it untenable. That's not true. It's because it didn't work anymore. And I think that whilst we do need a coherent plan for steel, I totally agree with you, and we need a longer term plan around energy prices for energy intensive industries and a coherent decarbonisation plan. And we all agree as the three trade unions that we need a route to decarbonise steel because of the commercial environment that British Steel find themselves in. The intervention that was made by the government has given us the space to be able to make that plan, rather than making rash short-term decisions that leave options off the table that if we had more time we could make.
No, I do understand that, but on the one hand we're watching Aberdeen die a death because we're not using the natural hydrocarbons, i.e. gas and oil, which we have offshore the Shetlands and across the country. But on the other hand, we're intervening to rescue an industry which relies on cheap energy. We have the most expensive energy in Europe here, as you all know. So what is the solution to that? Other than, because at the end of the day, this committee exists to protect the British taxpayer, who is abused at all turns and twists by the government. And they all may very well have helped you with this intervention, and I understand the reason for actually intervening to save the closure of the furnaces. I'd like to see blast furnaces here producing for national security reasons, but I don't see a plan from the government. And on the one hand, they're destroying our energy industry, and on the other hand, they're trying to bail out our steel industry. Does that not strike you as slightly odd?
I was just going to say, there's a challenge here. Look, first of all, ownership, as I alluded to in my first statement, is only one element of how you get a stable industry. It doesn't matter whether that's in any sector. Ownership is one element. We had uncertain ownership, so that had to ever step in to resolve. The market had failed, so we had to step in. That's absolutely my position. Let me finish this point. So the rest of the world provides a stimulus to protect their steel industry. You go to France, you go to Germany, they have
cheap energy.
And they put through cheap energy and other measures, I would argue, whether that's procurement or other. So there is a stimulus. So if you want British Steel to function in a competitive environment, you have to be able to provide the same level of stimulus, particularly now when the market has failed, to give some certainty around how that will work. The environment that British Steel needs to operate, and I absolutely support Charlotte's view here, part of that's around investment, because for a number of years we haven't had the investment in plant that was needed to make British Steel competitive, or for them to be, as productive.
Have you discussed the government's energy policy?
As they, absolutely.
Have you told them that this is the root cause of your problem?
Absolutely. At every turn, it is being presented that unless you can create an environment around tariff, around taxation, around the barriers to investment, around the energy that needs to be significantly cheaper for that to work effectively, then effectively you'll never have a stable steel industry. So I think that's fully understood. But also, if you're going to make British Steel a strategic industry, because you look at the volatility of price, supply, conflict, all the other factors that mean you never, you look at all those factors, you have what you call, classically in economic terms, a lad from Lincolnshire, son of a steelworker here, you'd say absolutely that you've got an imperfect market. So you have to do so only a stable plan to make sure that you can invest effectively in the steel plant, to make sure it's effective, only making sure that you set it as a strategic industry and make sure that steel is a critical part of your infrastructure going forward. Remember, you're not investing here in a market that's diminishing, you're investing in a growth market. We provide a very small proportion of steel usage for our country. So you look at the other factors across the world, if you leave yourself vulnerable to those factors...
You understand all that, and I totally buy into the strategic importance.
But Mr. Lowe,
but the oxymoron I can't get my mind around is, on the one hand, we're bailing out an industry we're killing on the other hand.
But Mr. Lowe, we've got the basis of the question. I think you must let people answer.
But you don't get to do one without the other. You have to create a stable industry to make sure that it can do all the things that you need it to do.
You can't do that with high energy prices.
But you have to do it at the same time to enable you to transition. There is nobody who advocates for cleaner, greener energy, good, clean energy that works effectively than I can assure you. Do I think solar panels should be on fields? Another point, Chair, forgive me. Of course I don't. But what we lack is cheap energy that will enable that plant to work effectively. That's a significant barrier, and I would argue that some of the government's policies around energy are fundamentally flawed when applied to the steel.
That was the answer I wanted to get.
I'll happily give you those, but the steps to make it, you can't do it in isolation. You have to work those things through together, and then you'll have a viable business plan that means we're meeting market expectations, competitive to the world, and more importantly, you've got certainty over the steel you're going to need and use, and at the same time we keep jobs in my local economy.
No. I think did you want to come in? Yes, Paul, please.
Just. We can't sit here and you mentioned about steel being made in China, etc. We can't dictate that, but we have to look at what's happening here. Now, British Steel is part of different companies in the UK that is part of a supply chain that is going to make valuable product, valuable infrastructures for this country to make it secure. Plate mills, everything that we need to look at. So it goes across the board. What's happening in Port Talbot? How the unions reacted to Port Talbot with the furnaces going down, a bit too early. We should have maybe stood back and watched what was happening. There's a transition happening there. We're supporting that transition, but regarding what's happening in the UK, we have to look at the bigger picture, because there is steel companies that is producing steel with that furnaces here. But the bigger picture is how we can get to that aim. And I understand the question, and I think you may be trying to get us to say that there's no plan for British Steel in this country. There is a plan. There is a plan to secure those jobs. Now, the average person within those plants, for that bigger picture, really isn't interested. It's what goes on his table for his kids that night, or the mortgage for the house. That's what they're interested in at the minute, and that's what we're trying to protect as trade unionists. And the bigger picture regarding those issues around energy, of course we've told the government energy needs to be reduced. Why wouldn't we? Because it's too high. Everybody can see that. But we can only deal with what's in front of us, and we're trying to do that step by step by working with these companies. I was up at Hartlepool 42-inch mill the other week. Now, the transition that's happened there, with a company coming in and giving future and giving stability to those people that were laid off for months and months and months. They're back now at work. It's fantastic for the area, for the local economy. We need to see that bigger picture, not just
right
narrow
now,
it down. Not just narrow it down.
The taxpayers funding it.
We understand
it's
that.
It's not a viable industry at the moment.
But the plan would make it viable. There's economists that already said that. Within the steel industry in the UK, we have got a viable business that can succeed. Yeah, we may need that little lift up, and that comes from the taxpayer, and we understand that money's valuable to the taxpayer, which we're all part of. For me, I think it's money well spent.
But finally...
hang on, Rupert, Linda and Charlotte, would you like to have a go at this at all?
Look, I mean, as far as energy costs are concerned, my union has openly campaigned, on high energy costs, particularly, what has been happening in the North Sea. I'm not going to sit here and deny that, and we've actively been campaigning because we have workers in the North Sea, we have workers in oil refineries, etc. So, yeah, there has to be a lot more done around a government energy policy because, every one of us sitting here represent members that are in industries which are high intensive energy users, and it makes them really uncompetitive.
Doesn't matter whether it's cement or aluminium.
Exactly.
And it's
glass.
And just to finish off, the issue in the steel industry and energy prices is not gas, it's electricity.
Yeah.
At Scunthorpe they burn blast furnace gas, so they don't have a natural gas connection, which was part of the issue we had with closing the blast furnaces, but it's the electricity prices that are the issue there, and projects like Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C and the new nuclear projects that have been announced will help reduce those energy prices. There's more to do, and there's certainly more support required for the North Sea oil workers. GMB campaign alongside Unite incredibly seriously around those things.